Revolution and Counter-Revolution, or Germany in 1848, by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Chapter 8. Poles, Czechs, and Germans. March 5th, 1852. From what has been stated in the foregoing articles, it is already evident that unless a fresh revolution was to follow that of March 1848, things would inevitably return in Germany to what they were before this event. But such is the complicated nature of the historical theme upon which we are trying to throw some light, that subsequent events cannot be clearly understood without taking into account what may be called the foreign relations of the German Revolution. And these foreign relations were of the same intricate nature as the home affairs. The whole of the eastern half of Germany, as far as the Elbe, Saal, and Bohemian Forest, has, it is well known, been reconquered during the last 1,000 years from invaders of Slavonic origin. The greater part of these territories have been Germanized to the perfect extinction of all Slavonic nationality and language for several centuries past, and if we accept a few totally isolated remnants, amounting in the aggregate to less than 100,000 souls, Wends or Sorbians in Lusatia, their inhabitants are, to all intents and purposes, German. But the case is different along the whole of the frontier of ancient Poland, and in the countries of the Czechian tongue in Bohemia and Moravia. Here the two nationalities are mixed up in every district, the towns being generally more or less German, while the Slavonic element prevails in the rural villages, where, however, it is also gradually disintegrated and forced back by the steady advance of German influence. The reason for this state of things is this. Ever since the time of Charlemagne, the Germans have directed their most constant and persevering efforts to the conquest, colonization, or at least civilization of the east of Europe. The conquest of the feudal nobility between the Elbe and the Oder, and the feudal colonies of the military orders of the Knights of Prussia and Livonia only laid the ground for a far more extensive and effective system of Germanization by the trading and manufacturing middle classes, which in Germany, as in the rest of Western Europe, rose into social and political importance since the end of the 15th century. The Slavonians, and particularly the Western Slavonians, Poles and Czechs, are essentially an agricultural race. Trade and manufactures never were in great favor with them. The consequence was that, with the increase of population and the origin of cities in these regions, the production of all articles of manufacture fell into the hands of German immigrants, and the exchange of these commodities against agricultural produce became the exclusive monopoly of the Jews, who, if they belong to any nationality, are in these countries certainly rather Germans than Slavonians. This has been, though in a less degree, the case in all the east of Europe. The handicraftsman, the small shopkeeper, the petty manufacturer is a German up to this day in Petersburg, Pest, Jassy, and even Constantinople, while the moneylender, the publican, the hawker, a very important man in these thinly populated countries, is very generally a Jew, whose native tongue is a horribly corrupted German. The importance of the German element in the Slavonic frontier localities, thus rising with the growth of towns, trade, and manufactures, was still increased when it was found necessary to import almost every element of mental culture from Germany. After the German merchant and handicraftsman, the German clergyman, the German schoolmaster, the German savant came to establish himself upon Slavonic soil. And lastly, the iron thread of conquering armies, or the cautious, well-premeditated grasp of diplomacy, not only followed, many times went ahead of the slow but sure advance of denationalization by social development. Thus, great parts of Western Prussia and Posen have been Germanized since the first partition of Poland, by sales and grants of public domains to German colonists, by encouragements given to German capitalists for the establishment of manufactories, etc. in these neighborhoods, and very often, too, by excessively despotic measures against the Polish inhabitants of the country. In this manner, the last 70 years had entirely changed the line of demarcation between the German and Polish nationalities. The Revolution of 1848, calling forth at once the claim of all oppressed nations to an independent existence, and to the right of settling their own affairs for themselves, it was quite natural that the Poles should at once demand the restoration of their country within the frontiers of the old Polish Republic before 1772. It is true, this frontier even at that time had become obsolete, if taken as the delimitation of German and Polish nationality. It had become more so every year since by the progress of Germanization, but then the Germans had proclaimed such an enthusiasm for the restoration of Poland that they must expect to be asked, as a first proof of the reality of their sympathies, to give up their share of the plunder. On the other hand, should whole tracts of land, inhabited chiefly by Germans, should large towns, entirely German, be given up to a people that as yet had never given any proofs of its capability of progressing beyond a state of feudalism based upon agricultural serfdom? The question was intricate enough. The only possible solution was in a war with Russia. The question of delimitation between the different revolutionized nations would have been made a secondary one to that of their first establishing a safe frontier against the common enemy. The Poles, by receiving extended territories in the east, would have become more tractable and reasonable in the west, and Riga and Milan would have been deemed, after all, quite as important to them as Danzig and Elbing. Thus the advanced party in Germany, deeming a war with Russia necessary to keep up the continental movement, and considering that the national re-establishment even of a part of Poland would inevitably lead to such a war, supported the Poles, while the reigning middle class partly clearly foresaw its downfall from any national war against Russia, which would have called more active and energetic men to the helm, and therefore, with a feigned enthusiasm for the extension of German nationality, they declared Prussian Poland, the chief seat of Polish revolutionary agitation, to be part and parcel of the German Empire that was to be. The promises given to the Poles in the first days of excitement were shamefully broken. Polish armaments got up with the sanction of the government were dispersed and massacred by Prussian artillery, and as soon as the month of April, 1848, within 6 weeks of the Berlin Revolution, the Polish movement was crushed, and the old national hostility revived between Poles and Germans. This immense and incalculable service to the Russian autocrat was performed by the liberal merchant ministers, Camhausen and Hassemann. It must be added that this Polish campaign was the first means of reorganizing and reassuring that same Prussian army, which afterwards turned out the Liberal Party, and crushed the movement which Messrs. Camhausen and Hassemann had taken such pains to bring about. Whereby they sinned, thereby are they punished. Such has been the fate of all the upstarts of 1848 and 1849, from Ledru Rollin to Changarnier, and from Camhausen down to Haynau. The question of nationality gave rise to another struggle in Bohemia. This country, inhabited by 2 millions of Germans and 3 millions of Slavonians of the Tschechian tongue, had great historical recollections, almost all connected with the former supremacy of the Tschechs. But then, the force of this branch of the Slavonic family had been broken ever since the wars of the Hussites in the 15th century. The province speaking the Tschechian tongue was divided, one part forming the Kingdom of Bohemia, another the Principality of Moravia, a third the Carpathian hill country of the Slovaks, being part of Hungary. The Moravians and Slovaks had long since lost every vestige of national feeling and vitality, although mostly preserving their language. Bohemia was surrounded by thoroughly German countries on 3 sides out of the 4. The German element had made great progress in her own territory. Even in the capital, in Prague, the 2 nationalities were pretty equally matched, and everywhere capital, trade, industry, and the mental culture were in the hands of the Germans. The chief champion of the Czechian nationality, Professor Palaki, is himself nothing but a learned German run mad, who even now cannot speak the Czechian language correctly and without foreign accent. But as it often happens, dying Czechian nationality, dying according to every fact known in history for the last 400 years, made in 1848 a last effort to regain its former vitality, an effort whose failure, independently of all revolutionary considerations, was to prove that Bohemia could only exist, henceforth, as a portion of Germany, although part of her inhabitants might yet, for some centuries, continue to speak a non-German language. London, February 1852.